We are honoured to have four panellists join us today for a discussion on reimagining missional engagement after Me Too and Church Too. I'm sure you remember those hashtags. The panellists have each been asked to give an opening statement on the theme. Then they will respond to one another, and after that, we'll open the floor for questions. Please add your questions for our panellists at any time using the Q&A feature in Zoom. We'll try to answer as many questions as time allows. So to introduce our panellists. As a reminder, you can learn more about each of them on the speaker bio pages in Zoom events. And they'll be speaking in the order in which I introduce them here. Dr. Dara Delgado, Assistant Professor of Religious Studies and Black Studies at Allegheny College. Dr. Cathy Hine, International Director of the Association for Cooperation and Transformation, also known as ACT. Reverend Dr. Rajkumar Boaz Johnson, Professor of Hebrew, Bible, and Theological Studies at North Park University. And Dr. Christian Tsekpoe, Director of Postgraduate Studies and Research and Head of the Mission Department at Pentecost University, Accra. So let's begin our discussion. And Dr. Delgado, would you like to go first?
Thank you. Violence against women is a human rights issue, full stop. Sadly, it's also a long-standing issue. Even our biblical tradition affirms that the pervasiveness of this grotesque and, might I add, anti-God reality, because any action that is deliberately fashioned to destroy one half of the community cannot be anything other than atheistic at its core. When limited to the topic of femicide or gendercide, we know that nearly 3 women are likely every day to die by intimate partner violence. Femicide, the gender-based killing of women, is not a class or socioeconomic issue that only affects low-income countries. The statistics in the US prove this point. The US, boasting its categorization as a high-income country, accounts for 70% of the occurrences of gender-based killing of women worldwide. Said differently, the US ranks 34th for intentional female homicide at a rate of 2.6 killings per 100,000 women. Murder, of course, is just one expression of gender-based violence. Domestic violence is also a factor. Although the statistics vary, the numbers resonate with those related to femicide. 1 in 3 to 4 women are battered by an intimate partner, somewhere between 25 and 33%, making domestic violence one of the nation's most expensive healthcare issues. So on average per year, $5 to $10 billion, with the ages of victims ranging from 15 to 44. Additionally, 1 in 4 girls is sexually abused before the age of 18, despite shame and fear that they will not be believed or supported, which often leads to underreporting. We know that 1 in 6 women have experienced attempted or completed rape. Even as power is at the very root of these staggering and unsettling statistics, the moral of the story is that women are victims of gender-based violence simply because they are women. Ethicist and theologian Dr. Beth Gerhardt notes that the need to gain and sustain power undergirds gender-based violence against women and consequently furnishes the underlying belief that, quote, all types of violence against women centers around the idea that violence works, end quote. In other words, by using coercion, physical, psychological, emotional abuse, and or just withholding the resources needed by the victim, the perpetrator can get what he or she wants or needs. Well, concerning the most vulnerable, my favorite gospel is the Gospel of Luke. One reason for this is because of all of the canonical gospels, Luke contains the largest number of female motifs. Women show up in the text in such powerful and influential ways, even when they are tangential to the recorded event. How apropos that in such a gospel where women are seen and heard from beginning to end, Jesus's public ministry is introduced in terms of liberation. In this account, Jesus comes to the scene declaring that the Spirit of the Lord is upon him because the Spirit has anointed him to bring good news to the poor. The Spirit has sent him to proclaim release of the captives and recovery of sight to the blind, to set those free who are oppressed, and to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor. Without question, this message of liberation is not metaphysical. It is not even restricted to the abstract hope of heaven. Instead, it affirms the fragility and the tenuousness of the human condition, especially those who constitute the so-called least of these. Women broadly are woefully vulnerable to violence and abuse, but minoritized women and those who are underrepresented in this country are acutely and disproportionately vulnerable. According to Sanctuary for Families, quote, men are murdering Black women and girls at a rate almost 3 times higher than white women. For Indigenous women and girls, the homicide rate is 6 times higher than it is for their white counterparts. And current and former partners are responsible for 94% of these homicides, end quote. The challenge we are assigned is not to hear these statistics as of the world or separated from the life of the church. Instead, we are to wrestle with the fact that gender-based violence against women is part and parcel of the community that claims to align with the one who came to preach, release, and set people free. Moreover, we must take seriously that women victims in the church, if they were to report their assaults at the same rate as those outside of the community of faith, those numbers above would increase exponentially. Spouse and child abuse are common in the church. Some biblical scholars have tried to respond to this reality by looking at the role of the Bible, or better, how the Bible has been misused and misunderstood to validate dehumanizing teachings on authority, headship, and submission. Theologians, again, like Dr. Beth Gerhardt, have responded in kind by constructing a theology of the cross to provide a space to name violence against women as sin explicitly, and quote, an evil that is contrary to the will of God, end quote. Here she proposes a holistic framework that points to the whole church community's responsibility to address this issue, and so that we don't see it as just a women's issue. Through both approaches, biblical scholarship and theology, trusted scholars and theologians have had the difficult but necessary task of indicting the church. Instead of taking the position of Jesus, it appears that the church has adopted the traditional secular views of violence against women, especially as it pertains to silencing the victims. To that end, it has marginalized the plight of victims by privatizing the problem, calling it a family problem, blaming the victim, using psychological versus theological language, such as pathology over against sin, and not holding their assailants accountable. Well, how do we overcome? We are here today because we collectively agree that contrary to the normative practice, violence against women cuts at the very core of human integrity and dignity. Violence against women is sin. And like all sin, that which fails to glorify God as God, gender-based violence against women has individual and communal implications. The church naming violence against women as sin is only the start, however. From there, the work must include confession, and specifically confessing Christ. Establishing violence against women as sin that violates the rights and dignity of women as persons created in the image and likeness of God also means that being complicit and or silent about such violence subverts the power of the gospel, that power that belongs only to God. All efforts to usurp power from God, much less to subjugate, denigrate, and objectify another person, is thus the full hindrance of the proclamation of the gospel, and it is idolatry. To confess Christ, therefore, is to confess sin. To confess Christ, therefore, is to confess that all power belongs to God. To confess Christ, therefore, is to confess that the gospel is something that calls us or moves us to action, restorative and preventative action, action that resists evil, speaks truth to power, and stubbornly stands on the side of the oppressed, over and against cultural and ecclesial semblance of propriety and the pressure to save face. From confession, we must move to uphold that the liberty that Christ proclaimed. To do this, it is imperative that the church states in no uncertain terms that there is no redemptive suffering when it comes to violence against women. Such flawed theology is, again, anti-God. It lies against the will of God for all humanity and violates God's will for the family. Love and fidelity should not be tested and or proven on the victim's literal or proverbial backs. Violence against women, again, is sin. It is not a perverse penitential sacrifice that should be offered up to God. Finally, liberty, therefore, does not make concessions for ecclesial, cultural, or family norms that violate the will of God manifested in the freedom of Christ. Christian liberty, which seeks the preferential option for the poor, disenfranchised, and abused, requires radical solidarity, not merely in platitudes, intellectual assent, or warm affections. Rather, liberty or freedom must assume the full responsibility of other regard in terms of care, but also in justice work that extends beyond our borders. In practical terms, in the life of the church, this means adopting a Bonhoeffer model. First, by preaching the truth via the cross and the gospel of Jesus Christ. Two, actively aiding victims of injustice. And three, fearlessly resisting evil in all of its structural forms. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Wow. Dr. Hine.
Thank you. I'd like to share two stories as I face this topic. The first, the story of a mission organisation. It's now known as Interserve, though it's been through multiple name changes in its 170-year history. In the 1850s, Interserve was started by women to reach women. It had a focus on women who had least access to education, to health, and opportunity for encountering Jesus. And this was on the Indian subcontinent. For 100 years, Interserve was an all-women's organisation. But in the 1950s, men joined. I'm troubled by three things in this organisation that I love for many things and I've been a part of for many years. Firstly, we have a narrative that says men were invited to join the organisations in the 1950s to enable mission to be carried out more completely and more holistically. But I've yet to find the historical documentation of this invitation. Is our narrative true, or have we perpetuated a myth or allowed a myth to be perpetuated towards us? Secondly, as I searched the historical archive, I found this statement from the first official male leader, and I quote, "I have spoken elsewhere of the magnificent work which our missionaries are doing, but it's my opinion that the deep commitment of a lady missionary to her particular work does not lend itself to the development and cultivation of a mind which can grapple with the problems of policy, strategy, and finance." End of quote. Statements such as this shape the organisation as much as the positives that we may wish to focus on. We talk of the qualities in the DNA of an organisation like Interserve that have come from being an all-women's mission. Thirdly, it's not just our history that raises questions of bias, of marginalisation, and of organisational culture. There are too many stories that indicate that we perpetuate building barriers where Christ has broken them down. Barriers that marginalise women and lock their voices away. Barriers that rely on blame that silences as it creates the other from within. My second story focuses on the pain of being a woman who watches the marginalisation of sisters from other faiths in mission today. I've worked for many years in areas where Islam is dominant. I've been trained to reach out, trained to disciple, and I've been engaged in that area for nearly 40 years. But there's a problem. Our missiology, our strategies, and our practices for walking faith journeys with our sisters living under Islam are largely androcentric. Apparently, it's okay to ignore the reality that women negotiate the everyday of living faith in very different ways to what are most often orthodox articulations of that faith. I've lost count of the number of times I or women like me have reported that their shared experience with their Muslim sisters is dismissed as simply untrue to Islam and therefore irrelevant to the gospel. In one of the When Women Speak courses presently running, when we talk about life stages, rites of passage, purity, honour and shame, everyday life issues for women, I hear repeatedly, why isn't this included in our preparation and our training? The Indian sociologist Spivak coined the phrase, white men saving brown women from brown men. For me, this is a call for us to examine how the way we use and present the gospel might be in fact more as a tool of power and manipulation than as an invitation to relationship. After a recent meeting in the UK of people who engage with those living under Islam, I had distraught women asking, is there no other way than using the gospel as a hammer that breaks the other faith apart? We have imagined in the Muslim world that if we reach men, we will reach the community, even though the evidence indicates that this assumption is incorrect. A believer from a Muslim background is reported to have said, why would I share with my wife? She's just a village woman. So I find myself asking, in what ways might our missiologies, our strategies, and our ways of creating them, in what ways might our practices in themselves be a form of violence against women? Failure to listen to women, their faith and lived experience allows us to hide behind theologies and missiologies that deny women their unique encounters with Jesus. Think the Samaritan woman, the Syro-Phoenician woman, the woman who suffered bleeding. Those things that will challenge cultural and theological frameworks that hinder women in their own lives and the lives of their communities will firstly not be strategies. Overcoming barriers will include sacred spaces, spaces where women can give voice to their disempowerment in our strategies and practices, and in doing so, demonstrate their own agency. One woman, follower of Jesus from Islam, said to me some time back, after we had shared that sacred space as a group of women, she said to me, please don't give them our story. It's not a course, it's our story. Overcoming barriers will also include, I believe, a reimagination of power through the lens of relational connectivity. Suad Joseph, a Lebanese anthropologist, says, and I quote, one is never just a single person. One always is already a set of relationships, multiple intersections of connectivity, It's the relationships that position a person for access, for rights, for privileges, for resources. It's the relationships that shape selfhood and identity. A missiology, a theology of relationship, of relational connection, will be an essential ingredient in reimagining power and in moving away from its abuses. Overcoming barriers will include women's voices reinterpreting theology and faith. Women most often engage their faith, as both Christians and Muslims, from a place of lived experience. In embracing these fresh encounters with God through lived experience, we learn how women negotiate their daily lives, how they reinvent power, how God meets them as the God who sees. From the most unexpected sources, we have the most profound insights into the being, nature, and reality of God. I'm ever grateful to Hagar, who has left for us a legacy of what it means in the midst of violence to navigate life, encounter God in a way that deepens our understanding and our experience of God. I've been thinking, what hashtag will our Muslim friends use of our generation of mission? And I think of this particularly in regards to women. How do we overcome Me Too, Church Too? Well, I hope we begin to see hashtag connected or belonging, included, God sees, relationships, sacred space. Thank you.
Thank you for that challenging presentation, Dr. Boaz Johnson.
Thank you so much. I'm so thankful to Dr. Kirsteen Kim and to Fuller Theological Seminary for inviting me to this amazing set of sessions here. So thankful for you, Dr. Dara Delgado, for your amazing presentation, bringing us up to speed with what is going on here in the United States, and how there is so much violence and degradation of women. And thank you, Dr. Cathy Hine, for your presentation. My thoughts really go back to my years in India, and I know InterServe quite well. And I'm so troubled by how women's voices have been silenced and shut down, and so much injustice has been done. I'm just coming out of a conference where with the Independent Council of Independent Colleges, where we talked about institutional saga of institutions here in the United States and how the voices of women like Mary Lyon has been shut down. Even in the seminary that she established that is now called Mount Holyoke College, she caused so many women to start institutions of learning to deal with precisely the issues that we are engaging with, and yet those voices have been shut down, and our young people don't get to hear their voices. Just one more aside. Yesterday, I got together a group of women from my church, where I serve as a transitional teaching pastor, with Afghan women who have had to flee Afghanistan and are living in Turkey and France and Germany, in Pakistan, and we were going through the Psalms of Lament. And I wanted my sisters here in the United States to listen to the interpretation of my sisters who are just 3 years in their relationship with Jesus, or 4 years, or 5 years. That is what my quest has been, and I hope I'm able to bring some of that before you today. Two women that I've gone to constantly are one from India, and one from the West, from Northwestern University, right next to the university where I teach. North Park University is Northwestern University, and her name is Catherine Bushnell. And they dealt with the issues of Me Too and religions too in the context of the last plague, the last pandemic, in which they went to the core of how to deal with issues of Me Too and religions too, and that is to deal with the scriptural texts of these religions, and especially the Bible, and my resultant thought, as after reading their books, their translations of the Bible, and their analysis, was this book called The Marys of the Bible, the original Me Too movement. And the basic thesis statement is that as I read these amazing women, and I continue to explore more women, both in India and in African countries, and here in the United States, I get to see that the Bible was actually written to deal with what we address as the Me Too movement and the Church Too movement, or the Religions Too movement. A lot of that has been done in conversation with my sisters, in the slum where I was reared, in Congo, in Brazil, Ukraine, Colombia, Kenya. I don't have the time to go through stories, but you know these stories. You know these stories, and we need to listen to people like me. Have come to realize that I need to listen to the voices of my sisters of the past, sisters like Pandita Ramabai, who lived between 1858 and died in 1922. She took it upon herself to rescue girls who were taken into sexual slavery by high caste men. And she rescued them, brought them into a home, and established a home for them. And then as she read the Bible, she came to realize that the Bible that has been translated by high caste men, what missionaries did was they came into places like India and African countries, and they looked for people who could think. Who are these people? These people were high caste men. In the case of Hinduism, it was the Brahmins, and they translated the Bible into languages like Marathi and Hindi and Gujarati, but it's not the gospel for women. The names that were used of God, the names that were used to describe women were so derogatory. So Pandita Ramabai took it upon herself to rescue girls. She spent hours together at that desk there. This is a cutout of Ramabai. She was a small-built woman, but what a powerful woman, and I've learned so much from her. I took my outcast brothers to go and engage with Pandita Ramabai. And of course, at the 100th anniversary in 1985, the government recognized her. But what the government does is they recognize her only for the sake of recognizing her. It wasn't what she brought to society to eradicate the violence, deep-seated violence against women that is found in all religions in India: Hinduism, Buddhism, Sikhism, Islam, and yes, Christianity. She dealt with very crucial issues like, what is the root of it? She came to the realization that it was the Aryans that brought in Hinduism into India. These were people that came from the Caucasian hills, took control of the Indus Valley civilization, took control of Persia, present-day Iran, Aryan domination there, and the Hittite Empire, and so on and so forth. That's what she engaged with when she translated the Bible and came up with a translation which was published in 1922, in the year just before she died. And the Bible Society of India, they scoffed at her. They eradicated this translation, but I'm thankful to God that we can make this available to students today. Catherine Bushnell, very quickly, was reared in Chicago area, Northwestern University, went to China to be a missionary, finally published this volume, which I think is so important, God's Word to Women. It is a series of lectures that she gave for students. So her story begins in 1855, just about the time of Pandita Ramabai, and then she went to India, and here's what she found. She found that in India, the British were taking their soldiers to India, promising them girls in army cantonments. And so she fought against all these violences against women, and perhaps we can talk about that during our Q&A time. Here's a book that she wrote, The Queen's Daughters in India, and other articles that she's written, which teach me quite a lot. My basic thesis here is very simple. For someone like me, I need to listen to the voices of women. I need to go into, just like Pandita Ramabai did, and just like Catherine Bushnell did, I need to go into the villages and listen to the voices of those women whose lives have been shattered by patriarchy that emerges out of Hinduism, patriarchy that emerges out of Islam, patriarchy that emerges out of Buddhism, and yes, patriarchy that emerges out of our present-day modern Christianity. It's only when we listen to these voices, we hear the voice of God crying out for our women and saying, I'm there with you, Mary. I will save you so that you can come and stand beside me when I am suffering on the cross for the suffering humanity. May God enable us to do that as we discuss this very, very crucial subject further on.
Thank you for those concrete examples, Dr. Johnson. Dr. Tsekpoe. Tsekpoe is next.
Okay, greetings from Ghana. It's now in the evening, almost 7 o'clock in the evening in Ghana. I believe some of you are in the morning. Thank you so much for this opportunity. The subject of sexual abuse is a global problem that has kept many women in pain for years. So I think this discussion is important and crucial for us to engage over and over until we overcome, because since many of the perpetrators are people of power, society seems to protect them while the victims remain silent of these gruesome abuses for self-preservation and sometimes for fear of stigmatization. The big questions I want to ask here is, how may the church's missional role provide healing, restoration, and refuge for victims of sexual abuse? To what extent can the church deal with the perpetrators in acceptable ways? What can the church do to identify and deal with the root cause of sexual abuse in order to mitigate the menace? So, Me Too movement. It is important for us to understand that in recent times, women have broken the culture of silence and have courageously spoken about their experience to provide a community of solidarity for those who have experienced similar abuses. This movement is now what is popularly known as Me Too, although the term was coined around 2006 by Tarana Buke. It became popular and a powerful movement around October 2017, when the American actress Alyssa Milano used it in a tweet to express her experience of sexual abuse. The response to Milano's tweet coalesced into a movement that produced a collective courage for other women who have been raped, assaulted, groped, stalked, or harassed sexually to open up and either share their experiences or just indicate Me Too. So let me go to even the next one, because what I'm trying to say about this is how the Me Too movement started and coalesced into a very powerful movement, giving a voice to women to courageously speak about the abuses they are going through, because their silence has given more power to the perpetrators to continue doing what they do, and other people abusing women without any remorse. Then the Church Too movement. It's an offspring of the Me Too movement, which also coalesced to provide opportunity for women to share their experiences of sexual harassment, abuse, and assault within the church community. The movement seeks to encourage victims of church abuse to speak about their experiences on such issues without fear. This movement sought to provide a voice for survivors whose side of the stories have either not been heard at all or have been heard but not treated satisfactorily by the church. Church Too also became popular in 2017 when Emily Joy Allison decided to share her story and invited others who are abused to do same. She later published the book, Church Too: How Purity Culture Uphold Abuse and How to Find Healing. Now I want to look at the Me Too movement, Me Too, Church Too in Africa. Although the movement started from the United States of America, they have become a nascent movement that spread across the globe in recent times. Some African countries, including Ghana, Nigeria, Kenya, South Africa, Namibia, among others, have begun the Me Too, Church Too movement in different ways. This notwithstanding, the culture of silence on matters of sexual abuse is still very prevalent in African cultures for several reasons. Some of the reasons include the fact that, some of the reasons include cultural beliefs and family ties, where it is believed that issues of sexual abuse, for instance, incest, are taboos, and so people should not talk about them. In many instances, even if children who are abused are able to inform their parents, they ask them to keep quiet, especially because sometimes the perpetrators are people of power. So they think that by raising alarm, it could cause a lot of family problems. So they make these young girls keep quiet and suffer in silence. Also, lack of trust in the legal system, where some people believe that trying to report an issue of abuse will only lead you to public ridicule when the case will not go any far. In some cases, people lack trust in church leaders because cases of abuse have been reported in churches, and sometimes the response has not been very good the victims rather end up being stigmatized. Well, but we can see that these problems are also having their roots in the Bible. So I want to just draw attention to some biblical stories of sexual abuse. One of them is the powerful King David, who abused Uriah's wife, killed Uriah himself, and then married this woman. Unfortunately, the whole of Israel could not speak about it because David was a powerful king. Even when God spoke to Nathan to confront the issue, Nathan has to adopt a storyline to attempt telling the story or confronting the issue. Another story is how Ammon abused Tamar and then raped her. This story is also another pathetic one because David, the father of both Ammon and Tamar, could not do anything about the issue. Painfully, we read about how Tamar ended up in the house of Absalom, and then for 2 years, she was there without anybody to defend her, probably because Ammon was the son of the king. And of course, the king himself doesn't have the moral courage to confront the issue because he is also a perpetrator of sin. Well, I suggest that some of the many men who keep quiet when they are aware about abuses might also be culprits or probably are afraid of exposing the evil that is happening in society. Another story, which is also in the New Testament, is when we read about the woman who was caught red-handed in adultery, brought to Jesus. This is a surprising story because the woman was brought alone without the man she committed the adultery with. Don't know how that happened anyway. I will return to that particular story before I conclude. Power and powerlessness, the untold stories of African women. In fact, there are many untold stories of African women who have suffered some of these abuses, and up till now, these stories have not been told. There are stories of how the economic and unemployment challenges in Africa have rendered many young ladies as victims of sexual abuse. There are stories of teachers and lecturers who prey on vulnerable students with the promise of giving them good grades in exchange for sex. Very shameful. There are stories of close family members, including uncles, stepfathers, or even fathers who sexually abuse young and innocent girls within the home setting. There are stories of so-called pastors who promise to help vulnerable women out of their spiritual predicaments, but eventually abused them. So what I'm seeing here is that for these women, there are abusers on the streets, abusers in the job markets, abusers in the schools and institutions, abusers in the homes, abusers in the church. So where is the place of refuge? If all these places abusers are found? Well, I suggest, for me to end, I suggest that we need to look at this model, which I think that it's a very important model that Jesus left out for us. The biblical story of the woman caught in adultery, as recorded in John chapter 8, verse 1 to 11, reveal how the use of patriarchal power and the powerlessness of women was a problem even in biblical times. The woman caught in adultery was brought to Jesus alone without a male partner. It will not be an exaggeration to assume that it was men who arrested this woman and brought to Jesus. They were shielding the man involved in the adulterous acts. Could it be because this man was respected, one of the respected Jewish leaders, or what may be the problem? Jesus' response to the issue provides us with the following models for the church's missional engagement strategy for challenging the status quo in the light of the Me Too Church 2 events. The first one I propose is the church as a redemptive community. This aims for the church to provide healing, restoration, and be a place of refuge for victims of sexual abuse. The church must build integrity through consistent and genuineness to enable victims to have the confidence to share their stories and their challenges with church leaders. Such victims should not be stigmatized. Rather, they should be provided with counseling and support that will redeem, restore, and bring back their self-esteem and dignity and confidence to face life situation in its fullness. 2, the church must be a disciplined community. The church must be a disciplined community. In this case, the church should not cover up for abusers or perpetrators. Rather, the church should be bold enough to expose offenders to disciplinary missionaries, irrespective of their status, position, power, or wealth. Here again, discipline should go beyond just the perpetrators, but discipline for the Christian community as a whole, where virtue, the virtue of being one another's keeper and being a good neighbor should be upheld by every member of the Christian community. 3, the church should be a transforming community. This model has the potential to deal with the problem from the root. When Zacchaeus was converted, he decided to stop cheating and oppressing his victims. He even promised restitution for those he had cheated. This conversion story is not only good news for Zacchaeus, but also good news for the people he oppressed. The church's missional discipleship must be deliberate in working towards transforming selfish, heartless, and wicked people into disciples of Christ who love their neighbors as themselves. Finally, the church must be an empowering community. Power imbalance between men and women has been identified as the root cause for sexual harassment. This missional engagement, the missional engagement of the church, should be holistic enough, aiming at empowering women spiritually, empowering them economically, professionally, socially, and in all aspects of lives. I want to say that with the huge demographic growth of the church in Africa, a pragmatic approach of the church as a redemptive community, a disciplined community, a transforming community, and an empowering community would be capable of handling this issue and bringing it down, because many Africans are Christians. If the church can hold this responsibility boldly, the issue of sexual abuse will be reduced. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed. And thank you to all 4 of our panelists who've talked about reimagining missional engagement after Me Too and Church Too. We've had some very rich presentations. I would like to give priority, if I may, to the women members of the panel to feedback any further thoughts they've had, or any points they want to make in connection with other people's papers. So, Dr. Delgado, would you like to go first?
Well, I'm speechless by my co-panelists and the work that they have brought before us. So I thank all of you for getting my intellectual antennas up, but also charging with a sense of conviction. One of the scarlet threads I think that I have heard throughout was not only being able to hear and to see women and to hear their stories and to take them seriously, but this idea first brought up by Dr. Hine, and that with all the hashtags you provided, the one that stood out to me was God sees. And I know that you mentioned that Hagar was kind of your, if you had to pick a patron saint, if you will, right? I think that I almost want to hear you talk more about it, right? I understand the connection, I understand the relationship, but that notion of being seen by God. And then when I pair that with, and I apologize, Dr. Tsekpoe? Yeah. Him asking the question about where is their refuge, right? So this God sees, where is their refuge? And then where Dr. Johnson provoked us to hear these stories, I guess I just want to hear my colleagues more, because these things to me are very interwoven. Being seen, being heard, and this notion of home, this notion of safety, that women, there's no safe place for them. It was just thought-provoking for me. I just kept jotting things down and circling these points. So I'm just grateful. Yeah.
That's great. Thank you. Dr. Hine.
Yeah, a rich feast in many ways. I think I'm struck. The statistics that you start with, Dr. Delgado, are ones that we see regularly, almost to the point where they no longer have an impact on us. And I think that's the challenge for the church and the mission community today, to recognize that these statistics are more than statistics, that they're actually people. And it's the story behind the statistics, which all of my co-panelists have referred to, the stories of women that are really important. And yet they're stories that we don't own in order to make a point. One of the things about power is that so often we use it for ourselves to make a point. And it seems that as we read the biblical story and the lives of women in there, very often they're allowed. The thing that Jesus did so differently was invite women to tell their story. And I think of women like the bleeding woman. Why on earth did Jesus call her out in a crowd? Because for her to be able to give voice to her story in the encounter with Jesus became part of the place of healing. So as I've listened to people, I'm encouraged and challenged not to take the stories that are behind the statistics, but to create spaces for those stories to be brought up in ways that enable women's agency to reimagine the power that's behind them.
Mm-hmm. Dr. Johnson, did you have anything that you would like to add?
Well, I would just say, I'm so thankful for my panelists, and so thankful for statistics that you bring up, and more and more it's kind of reinforced in my mind, Dr. Hine, as you shared about Inner Serve, and as you shared about your experiences in the Islamic world. We need to reverse that trend. I think Me Too and Church Too would be served a lot better if we only let our sisters speak and let the men shut up for once and just listen. Things will get sorted out if we only do that.
Thank you. Yes, and Dr. Tsekpoe.
Thank you very much. I think that I've enjoyed all the discussions from the various panelists, and I want to appreciate all the presentations and the panel so much for the great work done. And once again, Dr. Delgado, is that the pronunciation? Yeah. Think that one of the revealing aspects of your presentation that kept me thinking is how the Bible has been used in some cases even to support violence against women, and the emphasis that violence against women is sin. We should not support that. I think it's a very great one. And for Dr. Hine, I think I also want to support that we create hashtags, and I'm going for connected, #connected. And of course, God sees is another wonderful hashtag, which I think after this conference, we should be hashtagging God sees connected. And Dr. Johnson, thank you. I need to listen to the voices of my sisters. Very important insight. Thank you, everybody, for the presentation.
So we had some interesting discussion in the chat as you were speaking, and we also have some questions now raised. There's a question to Dr. Hine specifically, as you mentioned in your presentation, the women did not want you to share their story. Could you please share what is your ethics of communication/reporting in Christian organizations? How do we find the balance to share testimonies of what God is doing without making our sisters on the ground like a marketing tool? And I think you partly addressed that. But also the question of reporting, I'd be really interested to hear you on that. And how has that worked in the mission organizations that you've looked at?
Yeah, it's a challenging area, isn't it? Because the images that we use, whether they're word images or photographic images, are often those that create the victimhood of women. That's people want to help need, and portrayals of women's victimhood are often the sorts of things that stimulate the world around us, the church, to give. And so I think that there's a couple of things that I would say. I think the first one is we have to be really honest and sometimes listen simply for the sake of listening. There's a sacredness in the stories that are shared so often with us. People share them with us as people, not as a production. Now, of course, that's challenging if you're the communications person and you need to get something out. So I think there needs to be a very honest allowing of the person whose story we may be capturing to reflect back on what we've written and to enable them to say, this is not something, even after we've got to the almost production stage. And I think that the other thing is creating spaces where those voices can be their own voice, not the voice someone else uses to achieve a certain end, but their own voice. I think of this in my area in the Muslim world because so many of our sisters have been journeying in faith now for 10, 20 years. Why am I doing the research on them? Why am I telling their story? Why don't I step back and create spaces where they can use their story, can tell their story in ways they want to, for the people they want to tell it for?
May I add to that, Dr. Kirsteen Kim? I'm so thankful for my sisters, celebrity sisters who have brought the Me Too movement and the Church Too movement to the fore. I think it's important to recognize that. However, it seems to me that the voices of my the common, Shudra, enslaved sisters has not been told. And one of the things that I was very thankful for is when Marys of the Bible was published in India, there were 7 women organizations who brought forward 7 just common women, really poor women from the slums of New Delhi, who shared their story in front of those people that abused them. This is kind of unheard of. It was mind-boggling that they stood up there and they said, you have not heard this 35 years ago, but I'm here to tell you what happened to me, and this is freeing to me. So if we can make that happen for more of our sisters all across the world, I think we would have accomplished quite a lot.
Mm-hmm. There's another question in the chat that relates to the African context as well that Dr. Tsekpoe was describing. That it says, I admire the model you are proposing, but my question is beyond models. How do we make the women, I'm not sure I like that turn of phrase, come out to tell their stories in the African context in a largely male-dominated environment, even in the church? Could you speak to that, please?
Yeah, thank you. I think that it's important for us to engage in conversations like these it is also important for us to start listening to women and taking actions. When people see actions and they have confidence in the various institutions, both the church and our legal institutions, people will begin to come out. One of the reasons they are not coming out is the fact that they don't have trust in some of the institutions that should be protecting them. So when trust is restored, women will begin to speak. And also, I think that the church should start talking about cultural ideologies that actually put fear into people to share some of these stories of suffering they are going through. Because when they are silent, they suffer alone, they don't receive any support. So we need to start decoding, reimagining, mission, reaching out to some of these abuse, victims of abuse, and see how we can liberate them to come out and tell their stories. So I think conversations like these are very important for liberation.
Mm-hmm. Dr. Delgado, I'd like to hear you on this.
Yeah, I was particularly taken with the model that was provided about the church as. So the church as redemptive, disciplined, transformative, and empowering. And I have to admit, the part that I got, at first, I was ready, like, okay, well, where do we do the accountability piece? But what Dr. Tsekpoe actually put out in terms of discipline as being bold enough to expose. Right. So that conversation about trust is the fact that the church is moving into a place of, we're not just doing the status quo, right? We're not just trying to protect image. We're not trying to protect brand. We're not building cults of personality where women become these secondary figures in support of something else. But that boldness to name, as I said repeatedly in my paper, sin, but to also name offenders, right? That is something that is, I think, yeah, I'm also not very fond of the turn of phrase make, but that invitation, I think, to find ourselves in positions where we can hear these stories and be able to act in strategic and constructive ways would be, it would start with the witness of the church being bold enough to say, this is intolerable here. This is that sign that was actually shown in the PowerPoint that said, thou shalt not rape, using very explicit and direct language that these types of abuses are not tolerable in the kingdom. They are not acceptable. We're not whitewashing it anymore. We're not excusing it. And if anything, I think that is the thing that moves it from the abstract to the concrete, where we can actually feel the wheels on the ground, letting folks know that in this space, this is intolerable. And so, yeah, that's my little take on it.
Yes, and I think we also need to be mindful of the risks that we put women in if we encourage them to speak out, and how we're going to support them if they do. Here in California, we have this Title IX legislation, which means we have to have certain procedures in place in our institution so that women can report sexual abuse of any kind, or harassment or whatever. I'm wondering, from the 4 people we've got here, if your churches have similar mechanisms, and if not, should there be? We've got 2 minutes for you to briefly tell us whether your church has mechanisms for women to report in a safe space what's happened to them, and or to raise a complaint. Go in the order that we started, Dr. Delgado.
Yeah, so we actually have an affiliate non-for-profit that has trained counselors who are there 3-4 times a week. And so we have a unfortunate history. We just have to name it, is a reality, right? But so it's a blessing that there's a space for women to go to, women and girls to go to, but it's unfortunate that that's a reality that they have to take advantage of. So it is, it's not the local church proper, but it is a part of the affiliate. And so we have run into, and this was during my time of even working there, We've run into those who have come and recognized that they needed some place to kind of do this work and have this conversation and be honest about what their experiences have been, along with the counseling that they were receiving. And then we've had others who weren't as bold, brave, weren't ready. They just weren't ready because it had too many other things attached to it, where they weren't ready to disclose their story for feelings of safety, trust, whatever. So yes, it's there for those who feel like they can take advantage of it or would like to, but we see a mixed crowd in terms of those who want to avail themselves of those services. And it's understandable. It's definitely understandable.
Anybody else want to comment on whether there's such a service available in their institution or church?
I would say that in a multicultural mission organization such as I'm with, the question is, what is that? What are the mechanisms that invite those from a non-legal driven culture? How do you create them? And I think that's what we're wrestling with, to recognize that the one way driven by the West is not the only way to create those safe spaces and mechanisms.
Thank you. I think on that point, I'm reminded I need to begin to wrap up. So thank you very much indeed to all our panelists. And we really appreciated the preparation and the thought that you put into this and what you shared with us.